They called it a routine landing, right up until the sky tried to kill them. The dropship came in low over the treeline, armored skin glowing orange from atmospheric friction. Lightning crawled across the clouds like veins of burning metal, striking so close that hull plating screamed in protest. Wind shear hammered the engines sideways. Instruments flickered, corrected, then died, leaving the pilot blind over a world that hated being approached. The last clear transmission was not a scream, not a plea, but a stunned whisper from the co-pilot. "How do they live here?" Then the forest reached up and took them. Now the wreck lay broken in a basin of black mud and shattered trunks, its hull half submerged, its impact froe filling with brown water and oil. Rain fell in heavy, toxic sheets, beating and hissing on alien alloys. Static charges danced along twisted metal. Somewhere in the distance, something howled, too deep for any known predator profile, too long for any mechanical siren. Inside the cracked fuselage, the survivors realized the battle had already started, and they had not yet seen a single human. Armor filters whined under strain. Readouts spat out hazard warnings in colors reserved for reactor breaches. Gravity pulled hard at every step, turning simple movement into punishment. Every breath of standard breathable atmosphere felt thick, heavy, wrong. Muscles burned. Joints ached. The world's weight pressed down as if it resented every foreign footprint. They staggered out into a clearing that wasn't a clearing at all, just a patch of devastation carved into the forest by the crash. Shattered trees leaned like broken spears. Smoke coiled up in lazy spirals, joining a sky bruised purple and gray. Above the clouds, unseen, the rest of the invasion fleet traced elegant lines across the stratosphere, convinced they held the high ground. On the ground, it was already obvious they did not. The first officer to regain his bearings raised his weapon and froze. There, half buried in wet soil at the edge of the crater, stood a row of metal stakes. Not natural. Not random. Each stake was driven deep, angled just so, attached to a tangled web of fine cables and scavenged components. Improvised. Deliberate. A trap. Not one of theirs. When the wind shifted, they saw the other signs. Burned-out walker legs tilted at impossible angles, joints fused by heat. A reconnaissance drone, clearly of hegemony make, now flashed a different transponder code and hovered silently above the trees, its cameras focused inward on the crash site. Someone had taken it. Someone had learned it. Someone was watching. The survivors did not know where the humans were. They only knew they were not alone. Far above, beyond the storms, beyond the low orbital debris and the shimmering auroras of a magnetosphere at war with solar winds, the galaxy waited for a clean report. The invasion had been planned with confidence. After all, the hegemony had conquered harsher worlds. They had crushed empires older than humanity's first steel. Their models were precise. Their fleets were optimized. Their weapons had no equal. They had numbers. They had doctrine. They had experience. What they did not have was a memory of fear. The galaxy had a word for planets like this one, Deathworlds. Worlds whose gravity bent bones, whose seas tried to drown continents, whose skies struck the ground with fire as a matter of routine. Worlds where the line between life and extinction was measured in instincts, scars, and the willingness to stand back up when the planet itself said, no. Most civilized species orbited such worlds at a respectful, terrified distance. They sent probes. They wrote papers. They filed them away and moved on. Humanity did something different. They evolved here. They learned to walk in gravity that crushed alien knees. They learned to breathe air that corroded foreign lungs. They learned to build cities where hurricanes knocked them flat and earthquakes broke their foundations. They learned to look up at a sky full of lightning and say, "We will be here tomorrow." When humans finally broke free of their atmosphere and stepped into the night, the galaxy stared at them the way one stares at a wild animal that has somehow figured outdoors. At first, it was curiosity. Then suspicion. Then fear. The reports piled up, soldiers who kept fighting after wounds that would sideline other species for months. Workers on orbital rigs doing shifts in conditions that breached every safety protocol another civilization would tolerate. pilots flying through storms no AI would approve. Civilians wired to a concept called stubborn hope, which refused to yield even when logic suggested surrender. The hegemony watched this, waited, and reached a conclusion: unstable. A young Deathworld bred species with growing reach, unpredictable politics, and a talent for surviving disasters? That was not an ally. That was a variable. So they did what stable empires always do when confronted with something they do not fully understand. They decided to control it. A containment strike. A limited war. Just enough force to break the human capacity to threaten, not enough to trigger total annihilation. That was the plan. On the tactical displays, it was clean, efficient, inevitable. They did not factor in what it meant to declare war on a species forged in permanent crisis. They did not understand that there is a difference between a world you visit and a world that raised you. In the strategy halls orbiting distant stars, admirals spoke in percentages and vectors. On the surface of Earth, mud filled alien boots. Rain ate at their armor. The forest watched with 1,000 unseen eyes. You can fight a fleet. You can fight an army. You can fight a doctrine. But when you choose war with humans, you face something else entirely. You face the horrors lurking on their death world. And the death world is on their side. The order that began the war was delivered in a single, polished sentence. Operational containment of soul-born sapients authorized. Commence controlled pacification. No fury. No hatred. Just clinical language wrapped around an act of colossal arrogance. In the grand tactical theater aboard the hegemony flagship, Earth hung as a miniature sphere of blues and browns and whites. Data rings spun around it, population indices, industrial output, military strength, environmental hazards. Each factor reduced to a number, each number folded into predictions. The admirals saw a problem to be managed, not an enemy to be feared. Human starships appeared in those projections as clumsy shapes, overbuilt hulls, thick armor, redundant systems wired like someone expected the universe to break everything twice. Their reactors were safe but inefficient. Their weapons lacked sleek elegance. Their AI networks were constrained by irrational, ethical blocks. Primitive redundancy, one analyst scoffed. They waste mass on backups instead of trusting their systems. A junior strategist, fresh from simulations, dared to question. Their casualty tolerance curves are unusual. Their units maintain cohesion at loss ratios that would dissolve most forces. Psychological resilience indicators. Emotional instability. An elder cut in, dismissive. They cling to each other. That is all. Clinging, another added dryly, is not a defense against orbital supremacy. The decision flowed from those assumptions: strike the orbital infrastructure, cripple their eyes and hands, then descend with overwhelming ground forces. Shock, awe, containment. Within cycles, the Deathworlders would accept their place. The first phase worked almost exactly as predicted. Hegemony cruisers slipped into high orbit in synchronized arcs, their hulls shimmering as they shed the last traces of exotic drive wake. Batteries cycled. Targeting arrays aligned. Human satellites, stations, and defensive platforms blinked red across the board. The bombardments were precise. No wasted fire. Beams and kinetic lances reached down like threads of pure will, cutting through metal and stone. Human platforms flared and fell, burning trails through the upper atmosphere. Debris became new stars for a few brief seconds before vanishing into night. In the comms net, alien officers congratulated each other in controlled tones. Human space grid, compromised. Orbital defenses, degraded. Strategic surprise, achieved. They listened for panic. Instead, they heard work. In the crackling human channels their decryption suites could reach, there were no wailing demands for peace. There were coordinates, names, acknowledgments. Voices stayed low and focused, even over the roar of failing stations. Confirm evac vector. Switch to ground line. Satellite links gone. Lose the station, keep the crew. We knew this might happen. Move. Occasionally, laughter cut through, a sharp, defiant sound in the face of catastrophe. To alien ears, it felt wrong, like mirth in a burning building. They logged it as stress response, filed it away, and moved to the next phase. Ground deployment. On 100 hegemony carriers, dropships cycled through departure bays. Armored walkers strode into position, clamps locking them into descent modules. Troops sealed helmets and checked weapon systems, their armor HUDs painting Earth's surface in neutral colors. Red zones for projected resistance. Green zones for pacification staging. Blue icons for allied units. Weather overlays flashed warning sigils, then minimized. Atmospheric turbulence, magnetic storms, radiation belts, all noted, all accepted as within operational tolerance. A few risk officers objected. Earth's hazard level exceeded the usual range. Gravity alone would tax exoskeletons. Microbial profiles were incomplete. But political directives pressed from above. The war had already been announced to the hegemony's core worlds. To delay now would be to admit uncertainty. Empires like theirs did not admit uncertainty. The first waves dropped through the clouds. From orbit, the sight was beautiful, streaks of controlled fire descending in synchronized patterns, blooming into silent petals over continents. Insertions into abandoned airfields, highways, outskirts of major cities. Their models predicted limited human presence, scattered militias, chaotic resistance easily isolated. They found empty streets. Evacuated neighborhoods. Vehicles left in grids that were almost too neat. Windows covered. Doors barricaded. It looked like panic, but something about the patterns bothered the ground commanders. The emptiness did not feel random. It felt curated. Still, progress metrics looked good. Zones secured. Casualties low. Local infrastructure seized. They advanced. Then the small things started to go wrong. A mechanized column rolled down a highway that maps assured was stable, only for the tarmac to crumble under the weight of their heaviest walkers. Not sabotage, the underlying soil had shifted from recent flooding. Human construction norms had accounted for that. Alien assumptions had not. A base established on a hilltop woke to find their perimeter sensors blind. Local geomagnetic activity had spiked overnight, interfering with their systems. Human engineers knew this hill should never host critical electronics. The hegemony did not. A patrol crossed the dried riverbed, ignoring old markers they could not read, just hours before upstream reservoirs released their timed overflow. The resulting flash flood tore through vehicles, equipment, and soldiers alike. No human sniper fired a shot. They didn't need to. Command chalked these up as environmental incidents. Adjust models, patch protocols, move on. When contact finally came, it arrived not as a grand engagement but as a whisper of motion in the ruins. A drone, clearly hegemony made, drifted over a captured district, its transponder codes slightly altered. It relayed perfect telemetry, forwarding maps and sensor feeds to command. For hours, it worked flawlessly. Then, gently, it began to lie. Enemy positions appeared where no humans were. Safe routes were flagged through areas seeded with improvised explosives. Secure rooftops were marked on structures with hidden load-bearing weaknesses. When the first building collapsed under a squad, the drone's feed glitched only for a moment. By the time they realized the drone's firmware had been rewritten, dozens were dead. Human signatures remained elusive. Small teams, hit-and-fade strikes, vanishing tunnels. No big banner, no neat formation to crush. Just the constant reminder that every shadow might hide eyes, and every piece of their own technology might already be compromised. Still, High Command insisted the war was proceeding. Their fleets owned the sky. Their boots owned the ground. On paper. On Earth itself, every step forward felt less like conquest and more like trespassing in a place that did not want them there, a place whose true inhabitants had not yet begun to take them seriously. They discovered the truth about the Deathworld one aching step at a time. Marching across Earth was pain made into geography. Gravity pulled at their bodies with relentless insistence, forcing servos and muscles to strain just to stand upright. Soldiers who could sprint for hours on their homeworlds found themselves gasping after minutes. Joints swelled. Spines compressed. Every kilometer felt like two. Their armor, a masterpiece of hegemony engineering, became a cage. Cooling systems designed for desert suns failed under humid heat that clung to every surface. Filters clogged with pollen and dust unknown to their biologists. Power reserves drained faster as suits compensated for an environment that did not care about foreign tolerances. The planet was not trying to kill them. It simply did not care if they lived. They learned to respect the rain first. On many worlds, rain was a blessing, cooling, cleansing. Here, it came crashing down in curtains so dense that visibility collapsed to arm's length. Sensors flickered. Thermal imaging drowned in a gray haze. Roads turned to viscous rivers, swallowing vehicles up to their hatches. Lightning stitched the sky with a frequency that made uplink windows unpredictable. Armor plating, certified against corrosive atmospheres, began to show hairline etching along exposed seams after repeated storms. Not enough to breach, but enough to frighten. Under that same sky, humans moved like they had been born to it. Helmet cams caught them sometimes, silhouettes wading through mud that grabbed at alien boots, waterproof cloaks blending into the washed-out palette of ruined fields. They moved with an economy of motion that suggested intuition rather than calculation. They knew where the ground held, where it collapsed, where the water was shallow enough to cross and deep enough to hide. The aliens had maps. The humans had memory. In the forests, alien units found no solace. Trees towered overhead, their canopies thick enough to swallow satellite signals. Underbrush grabbed at armor joints, tripping those who moved too fast. Vines camouflaged pits. Insects swarmed in dense clouds, crawling over visors, shorting exposed contacts, biting through any exposed biomaterial. 2 soldiers died not from plasma or bullet, but from allergic shock to microscopic life that had never seen their species before that day. Around their camps at night, eyes glowed in the darkness. Predators circled, testing perimeters with patience honed over millennia. Wolves, big cats, strange shapes that shifted in night vision green. They rarely attacked fortified lines, but patrols that strayed too far alone sometimes simply never returned. Tracks were found. Blood, occasionally. Often nothing at all. Planetary fauna interference went into the reports. Fear went into their bones. Then came the humans in earnest. They did not engage where doctrine predicted. They avoided pitched battles unless they held an overwhelming situational advantage. Instead, they struck along edges, at joints, supply lines, relay outposts, field hospitals. A fuel convoy rolling through a canyon found both exits cut. Hooded figures had triggered landslides with charges placed days earlier. As vehicles reversed in confusion, artillery spoken in improvised calibers rained down from unseen ridges. When return fire finally found the source, the humans were already gone, leaving only empty firing positions and footprints leading nowhere. In lowland marshes, night patrols heard splashes behind them, always just beyond visual range. Something moved with them, matching their pace. When they turned, there was only mist and reeds. Then someone tripped a line. Charges buried in the mud transformed waterlogged silence into an upward blast that threw bodies and armored fragments into the air. Survivors flailed in suddenly deep water, their suits dragging them down. Shapes moved through the murk, humans in lightweight gear, cutting open harnesses, pulling some troops to shore, letting others sink, selective in a way that made no tactical sense until they noticed a pattern. The ones rescued were the ones who had hesitated to fire earlier on unarmed civilians. Mercy and message bound together. Psychological warfare seeped into their comms. Human signals wove into the hegemony network, a ghost voice that sometimes spoke in perfect translation. "You are tired," it would say, over footage of soldiers slumped in flooded trenches. "You should not be here. Your armor wasn't built for this gravity. Your food wasn't designed for this climate. Your commanders don't understand this sky." Then storm alerts would begin, and the predictions would come true with terrifying precision. At first, command dismissed these intrusions as tricks. But you cannot fake a river bursting its banks at exactly the time your enemy warns you. You cannot fake hailstones the size of fists slamming into vehicles that parked in the wrong valley because a human voice told them they would regret it. Patterns formed in the data. Earth was not alive. But humans knew how it moved, breathed, and broke. They spoke the language of its seasons and its disasters. They had learned, long before aliens came, how to live on the knife edge between catastrophe and survival. The invaders were learning that language too. The problem was that every lesson came with casualties. Doctrine began to fracture. Units refused to march during storms. Patrols demanded aerial overwatch. Humans had already learned to blind. Officers stared at hazard reports and felt, perhaps for the first time in their careers, the weight of genuine doubt. They had been trained to fight enemies who shared their assumptions: stable climates, predictable terrain, controlled environments. They had no doctrine for a world where the ground could liquefy overnight and the air turned hostile between dawn and dusk. They had no doctrine for a species that treated those conditions as ordinary. Rumors spread in the ranks that Earth resisted them, that the planet itself wanted them gone. The rational knew better. It wasn't the planet. It was the people who called it home. And they were only beginning to show what that meant. The war changed on a day the invaders thought they were finally winning. After months of grinding advance, hegemony banners fluttered over ruined human cities. Supply corridors stretched from fortified landing zones to inland bastions, armored by overlapping fields of fire. Maps and command tents glowed with reassuring colors, zones of control painted in calm, imperial hues. Casualties were high, yes, but the lines had moved. Metrics ticked upward. Territory occupied. Infrastructure seized. Resistance contained. They did not realize that humans had been waiting for exactly this. To trap something large, you must first let it believe it is free. In a bunker carved deep beneath shattered concrete, human planners watched the same maps, their displays updated by networks of buried fiber, improvised relays, and smuggled satellite imagery. Where the hegemony saw control, they saw overextension. Long supply lines. Overconfident concentrations of force. Bases built on ground chosen by foreign architects, not by those who knew what lay beneath. They began. First came the fires. Controlled burns, they called them, techniques honed over generations of living with forests that could erupt into uncontrollable infernos. Human teams moved through woodlands at night, setting lines of flame along carefully chosen ridges and valleys. Not to raise everything, but to steer. When the smoke rolled toward hegemony positions, it did so like a living thing. Thick, hot, laden with particulates their filters struggled to handle. Visibility dropped to nothing. Night vision fractured into useless static. Targeting arrays lost lock. Under that cover, human units surged forward. They struck at communication hubs, relay towers, sensor fields, slipping in and out as shadows woven into the burning haze. By the time the smoke cleared, entire sectors found themselves cut off, their reassuring icons on the map now isolated islands in a spreading ocean of uncertainty. Then came the water. Engineers and sappers, many of whom had once worked on dams, levees, and flood control, now turned their knowledge toward war. They identified choke points, rivers held back by aging infrastructure, valleys whose drainage systems could be overwhelmed. Explosives placed with surgical care shattered gates and culverts at precisely the moment heavy hegemony convoys rolled through low ground. Walls of muddy water roared down gullies and canyons, sweeping away vehicles that had no business in a floodplain. Bridges collapsed, not by direct attack, but because the soil at their foundations liquefied under volumes of water their designers never imagined. Roads became lakes. Flat fields transformed into sucking bogs that swallowed walkers up to their torsos. Above, human pilots in battered aircraft flew at altitudes no sane flight computer would approve, threading storms to drop supplies and munitions to isolated resistance cells. Thunderheads became arsenals. Lightning, once a random hazard, was now something they learned to dance around. Beneath the surface, another war raged. In data centers, basements, and hidden rooms lit by the blue glow of scavenged screens, human coders and technicians launched attacks not with guns, but with code. They had spent months capturing alien hardware, dissecting its logic, understanding not just its capabilities but its assumptions. Those assumptions became targets. Logistics networks, once models of efficiency, began to miss out themselves. A shipment of power cells, destined for a frontline bastion, arrived instead at a landing pad already overstocked. Medical supplies diverted to empty depots. Ammunition sent to coordinates that, upon inspection, did not exist. To hegemony eyes, it looked like clerical error. To the humans, it was bloodless sabotage. In the sky, some ships began receiving navigational updates ever so slightly out of phase, enough to make them burn more fuel correcting course, enough to ensure they arrived tired, late, and vulnerable. The invaders blamed one another. Software teams accused fleet officers. Fleet officers accused ground logistics. Truss frayed, and in those frayed edges, humans pushed. All of this occurred alongside something the hegemony had never truly accounted for: ordinary people refusing to remain ordinary. Factory workers retooled assembly lines to produce improvised armor and drone casings. Farmers dug hidden trenches and storage caches into fields, then plowed them smooth until they looked like any other stretch of earth. Students ran mesh networks through cities, keeping information flowing when official channels went dark. Medics set up clinics in subway tunnels, treating soldiers and civilians side by side, learning on the job how to handle alien wounds from captured manuals and sheer intuition. They did not ask if it was possible. They asked who needed them next. In the face of all this, hegemony models finally began to break. Their war games had never included populations that fought with such stubborn unity, while enduring environmental punishment that would cripple their own worlds. They had never simulated a scenario where the enemy understood every bolt of lightning and shift of the wind better than any machine. Cornered hegemony units started receiving human broadcasts. Some were offers, corridors of retreat if they abandoned heavy weapons and left prisoners unharmed. Others were warnings. Do not move into the valley. You have 1 hour to turn back before the dam upstream fails. When a few officers tested the warnings and found them true, the realization set in. Their enemy could have let them drown. Instead, the humans had chosen to demonstrate that they could kill at will and sometimes chose not to. That was not mercy the invaders understood. It was a level of control that terrified them. The term, Deathworlders, shifted in tone across hegemony channels. It no longer meant primitives from a dangerous planet. It meant those who have learned to make danger obey. And obedience was something the hegemony had thought belonged only to them. In the end, the hegemony did not lose because they ran out of weapons. They lost because they ran out of places to stand. One by one, the bastions they had carved into Earth's surface found themselves surrounded not by neat, besieging armies, but by the consequences of their own presence twisted back upon them. Valleys they had fortified became bowls filling with fog, smoke, and floodwater. High ground they had seized crumbled as controlled demolitions reshaped the rock beneath. Supply lines that once gleamed like threads of light on tactical displays now appeared only as question marks. In the command core of a once proud fortress, an enemy commander stared at a map that refused to make sense. Icons blinked out not just when units died, but when entire routes vanished, bridges gone, roads severed, tunnels flooded. Minimum safe extraction corridor? He demanded of his staff. There was silence. On the surface, his soldiers stared at horizons they no longer trusted. Every hill might conceal artillery. Every quiet forest might hide mines. Even the sky, once a source of reassurance with its hovering carriers, now offered no comfort. Human missiles had learned to find them, slashing up from hidden batteries with brutal suddenness. Fear settled on them like an extra layer of gravity. Human forces, for their part, moved with a cold clarity that had not existed at the war's beginning. They were tired, scarred, grieving, but no longer scrambling. They had seized momentum, and they knew it. In one ruined city, under shattered skyscrapers framing a bruised sky, human troops advanced alongside exoskeleton workers and civilian volunteers. Their armor was mismatched, their vehicles a patchwork of native and alien tech, their formations messy compared to immaculate hegemony lines. But their eyes, when caught for a moment by helmet cams, held something that no simulation could quantify. They were done being invaded. The hegemony considered a final option. From high orbit, where the air was thin and the stars were harsh, strategic weapons slept in armored bays. Orbital saturation, heavy bombardment to flatten resistant regions, cauterize infection, erase the stubborn. It would poison large sections of the planet, yes. It would cost reputations, yes. But it would restore control. The codes were prepared. Safeties were primed. Then the fleet received a message. It did not come over official channels. It rose from the planet itself, punching through jamming, piggybacking on frequencies the hegemony thought were secure. At first, they dismissed it as noise. Then it resolved into a human voice, calm and unhurried. "We know where your launch keys are stored." There was a pause, as if space itself listened. "And we know you don't want to go home as the admirals who glassed a Deathworld and still failed." Screens flickered. Diagnostics cascaded. Some command consoles showed nothing unusual. Others began quietly reporting anomalous access requests in subsystems that had never been connected to external networks. Human code, born in basements and bunkers, written by exhausted hands over flickering power, had found its way into the veins of hegemony firepower. They could still fire. But they could no longer be certain where those weapons would land. At the same time, distress calls poured in from ground units. Strongholds falling. Entire regiments forced into surrender corridors, stripped of heavy arms, marched out under human guard not toward labor camps, but toward shuttle zones. "Leave!" Human envoys told them through translators and simple gestures. It made no sense. Empires did not let invaders go without a price. The price was already paid, and it was not measured in prisoners. It was measured in understanding. A formal plea went out at last. The hegemony envoy spoke from the bridge of a flagship scorched by re-entry debris and scarred by near misses. "Hostilities concluded. Request terms of ceasefire." On Earth, in war rooms that still smelled of dust and sweat, leaders listened. Some argued for complete annihilation. Others, more tired than angry now, saw farther. Humanity had won the war here. But the galaxy was wide. The terms they sent back were simple. Withdrawal of all hegemony forces from Sol. Immediate release of human captives from all theaters of operation. Recognition of human sovereignty over their system. No future deployment of armed hegemony vessels within its outer boundary. And one more condition, delivered without threat in the tone, but heavy with implication in the words. "You will correct your charts," the message said. "When you mark Earth, you will not call it a target. You will call it what it is." A pause then. "A warning." The hegemony agreed. They had no choice. They withdrew, limping, minds filled with images they would spend lifetimes trying to explain. Soldiers returned with stories of rain that burned, gravity that crushed, animals that hunted like ghosts, and humans who laughed and bled and refused to fall down when they should have died. In academies across their territory, new lectures were written. War simulations added a new factor, Deathworld differential. Tactical manuals included a brief but stark note. Under no circumstances initiate ground operations on class-red biospheres populated by native sapients without comprehensive cultural liaison and explicit invitation. Unofficially, officers phrased it differently. Don't invade worlds that forge their people in daily disaster. News spread to other species as well. Some, fascinated, sent cautious envoys to orbit, requesting peaceful contact from a respectful distance. Others watched from far away and chose to edit their own expansion plans. On a hill overlooking a rebuilt district, a human engineer stood beside a communication array that now carried messages, not warnings. The air smelled of wet concrete, ozone, and the faint trace of regrowing grass. They looked up at the sky, no longer streaked with falling debris, just clouds and the distant gleam of stations being rebuilt. The world that had tried to kill them for ages was quiet, for the moment. They would go back to arguing, building, dreaming, failing, trying again. That was their nature. They were not gods. They were not demons. They were simply people who had learned that surviving here meant becoming something the wider galaxy recognized only as terrifying. Far beyond, in rooms where maps were drawn and futures imagined, strategists now wrote one phrase beside the symbol for soul. War with humans means war with everything that made them human. And that was a war no one wanted to fight twice.